The year is 1943. World War II is raging, and something extraordinary is about to happen in the heart of the American desert. This is the story of one of the war's most unusual chapters, a story few know, but one that reveals much about courage, adaptation, and human nature in times of conflict. Imagine for a moment the vast New Mexico desert, sand stretching as far as the eye can see, cacti dotting the arid landscape, the scorching sun transforming the horizon into heat waves. Now imagine thousands of German soldiers, veterans of Rommel's feared Afrika Korps, being transported to this remote location. They crossed the ocean as prisoners of war, expecting to find modern prisons with highly trained military guards. What they found was something completely different. When the first convoys arrived at the camp near Roswell, New Mexico, the German prisoners looked out the window and saw something that left them perplexed. Men on horseback, wearing wide-brimmed hats, worn leather boots, and carrying antique revolvers at their waists. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They were cowboys, true American cowboys, many too old to serve on the European front, others too young, and some who simply never left the ranch life. This is where our story truly begins, because what happened next defies all expectations about war, security, and control. How is it possible that men with no formal military training, no modern weapons, and no rigid army discipline managed to keep thousands of combat-trained German soldiers under control? This is a story about psychology, about territory, and about a way of life the Germans had never encountered before. If you're enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a comment about your viewing time. Now let's dive deeper into this extraordinary narrative. The problem began in 1942. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor, and the battles in North Africa were producing thousands of prisoners of war. Initially, the British captured most of them, but the camps in England soon became overcrowded. The obvious solution was to transfer them to the United States, where there was abundant space and resources to keep them away from the theater of war. But a critical question arose: where to place these men and who would guard them? The American army faced a serious dilemma. Every American soldier used to guard prisoners was a soldier not fighting on the front lines. With the war intensifying in Europe and the Pacific, there simply weren't enough troops to man the prison camps springing up across the country. Then someone came up with an idea that seemed absurd at first glance, but made a peculiar sense when you thought about it. The American West still had a vibrant culture of cowboys and ranchers. These men spent their entire lives managing vast tracts of land, controlling cattle across hundreds of square miles, surviving in extreme conditions with limited resources. They knew the desert like no one else. They knew every shadow, every water source, every hidden danger in the dunes and mountains. Most importantly, they possessed a natural authority that came not from uniforms or insignia, but from decades of experience in hostile environments. The proposal was presented to the governors of the southwestern states. They needed men to guard prison camps in remote locations. They didn't need to be soldiers, just men capable of maintaining order and preventing escapes. The pay would be modest, but it would be a service to the country. The response was astonishing. Hundreds of cowboys volunteered. Some had sons fighting overseas and wanted to do their part. Others simply saw it as a duty. And some, it must be admitted, were curious to meet these Germans so often talked about. The first camp to implement this system was established near Roswell, New Mexico in 1943. The location was strategically chosen. It was miles from any significant city, surrounded by a desert that few men could traverse without specialized knowledge. If a prisoner escaped, he would be fleeing not just guards but nature itself. And this is where the genius of the plan began to reveal itself. When the first 300 German prisoners arrived, they were greeted by a group of about 50 cowboys. The Germans, accustomed to Prussian military precision, were visibly confused. These guards didn't march in formation. They didn't wear standard uniforms. Their weapons were antique revolvers and hunting rifles, not the machine guns and automatic pistols they had expected to see. Some guards chewed tobacco as they watched the prisoners dismount from the trucks. Others simply remained astride their horses, hats shading their eyes from the sun, silent. The camp commander, an army major named Harrison, was present that first day. He observed the interaction between the cowboys and prisoners with great interest. He had instructed the cowboys on the basic rules: keep prisoners within the perimeter, prevent violence, ensure everyone was present for counts. But he made it clear that the methods were up to them. He trusted these men to find their own way of making things work. The first test came within the first 48 hours. A group of German prisoners, experienced officers from the North African campaign, decided to test their new guards. They began gathering in groups, speaking in German, making coordinated movements that seemed suspicious, testing the limits. It was a standard tactic, recognizing security weaknesses, identifying guards who could be manipulated or distracted. One of the older cowboys, a man named Tom Harden, over 60 years old and a lifetime of working on cattle ranches, noticed the behavior. He didn't react like a soldier would. He didn't shout orders or threaten with his gun. Instead, he simply mounted his horse, rode to the center of the group of prisoners and stopped. Then he did something completely unexpected. He dismounted, lit a cigarette, and began drawing in the sand with a stick. The Germans approached, curious. Tom was drawing a simple map of the desert surrounding the camp. He pointed north, then east, south, and west. Then, using basic German and heavily gestural, he explained something very simple. 40 kilometers in any direction. There was no water. 50 kilometers north, there was a canyon where rattlesnakes gathered in the rocks. 40 kilometers west, the desert became even harsher, with temperatures that could kill a man in a few hours. He pointed to his horse, then to his feet, and made a universal gesture of death. But what really captured the prisoner's attention was what he did next. Tom took his canteen and offered water to one of the Germans. It was a simple gesture, but loaded with meaning. He was saying without words, "Here in the desert there are different rules. Here water is life, and whoever knows where to find it holds the power." He finished his cigarette, mounted his horse, and rode back to his position. There were no more tests that day. This interaction set the tone for what was to come. Cowboys didn't operate based on military regulations or procedural manuals. They operated based on a deep psychological understanding, developed over decades of managing animals and men in hostile environments. They understood territory, natural hierarchy, and the power of the silent demonstration of competence. Over the next few weeks, a pattern began to emerge. The German prisoners, many of them experienced and proud soldiers, began to develop a curious respect for their makeshift guards. It wasn't the fear-based respect they had for their own superior officers. It was something different. It was the recognition of men who completely dominated their surroundings. The cowboys didn't need to shout or threaten because their authority came from something deeper. There was a cowboy named Jesse Martinez of Mexican descent who had a particular skill with lassoing. He could lasso a moving calf from 30 yards away. One day, some prisoners were arguing loudly, almost coming to blows. Jesse simply grabbed his rope, made a perfect loop in the air, and dropped it around a fence post 50 feet away. Then he looked at the Germans and smiled. The message was clear. If he wanted to, he could reach them before they took 3 steps. The argument ended immediately. But it wasn't just subtle intimidation. The cowboys also displayed a humanity that surprised the prisoners. They shared stories during the long, hot afternoons. Some learned basic German, and the Germans learned English. A mutual respect developed, based not on military hierarchy, but on a recognition of men who understood hard work and survival. Major Harrison observed all this with growing fascination. He reported in his official records that the camp had significantly lower incident rates than other prison camps around the country. There were fewer escape attempts, fewer violent confrontations, and fewer disciplinary problems overall. He attributed this to what he called the effect of hostile territory combined with competent native guards. There were, of course, escape attempts. It would be naive to think that trained soldiers would simply accept their captivity without resistance. The first serious attempt occurred in August 1943, about 3 months after the camp's establishment. 4 German prisoners, all officers, meticulously planned their escape. They hoarded small rations of food for weeks, created rudimentary maps based on observations of the sun and stars, and waited for a moonless night. They managed to get past the camp perimeter, which was less fortified than elsewhere, relying more on the desert as a natural barrier than on fences and watchtowers. The cowboy guards discovered their absence during the morning count. The reaction was instructive. While the army soldiers wanted to organize a formal search with jeeps and military equipment, the cowboy leader, A man named Bill Cody, unrelated to the famous Buffalo Bill but often joking about it, simply gathered 5 of his most experienced men. They looked at the sun, checked the wind direction, and began riding. They didn't follow immediately visible tracks, but used decades of accumulated knowledge about human behavior in desert territory. Water. The fugitives would need water. There were only 3 water sources within a 50-mile radius, and only one was in the direction a rational man would choose if trying to reach a populated area. They rode directly toward it. They reached the water source at noon. The 4 Germans were there, exhausted, blistered, sunburned, and clearly in trouble. They had managed to walk about 20 miles during the night, but the journey had broken them. When they saw the cowboys appear on the horizon, mounted on their horses, moving easily through the terrain that had been torture for them, something changed in their eyes. There was no resistance. One of them simply raised his hands and said in broken English, "You know this place." "We don't." Bill Cody didn't reprimand them. He simply gave them each water, waited for them to regain some strength, and then said something that was repeated many times later in the camp. "This desert would kill a man before I had to do anything. You're good soldiers, but you're not desert men." He had each of them mount behind a cowboy, and they returned to the camp. The punishment was minimal by military standards, a few days of solitary confinement, but the lesson was lasting. After this incident, the number of escape attempts decreased dramatically, not because the prisoners feared punishment, but because they genuinely understood that the wilderness was a more effective guardian than any fence or gun. The cowboys had demonstrated not only that they knew the territory, but that they were part of it in a way that the prisoners never could be. As the months passed, an interesting dynamic developed in the camp. German prisoners began asking for work. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be employed in non-military labor, and many camps across the United States were using prisoners for agricultural labor due to labor shortages. Cowboys organized work parties to help on local ranches, repair fences, assist with harvesting, and perform other rural tasks. This was another demonstration of the system's genius. The cowboys naturally integrated the prisoners into familiar work routines. Many of the Germans, especially those from rural areas of Germany, had experience working with the cowboys. Working with the cowboys gave them purpose, reduced the boredom that was a major problem in other camps, and created a working relationship that transcended the typical prisoner-guard dynamic. There was a cowboy named Frank Wilson who became particularly close to a group of German prisoners. Frank had lost his son in the Battle of Kasserine Pass, one of the first major American battles in North Africa, and initially harbored a great deal of bitterness toward the Germans. But as he worked side by side with them on the ranch, repairing fences under the scorching sun, he began to see them as individuals, not as abstract enemies. One day, one of the prisoners, a man named Klaus who had been a farmer before the war, noticed that Frank was having trouble with a particularly stubborn fence. Klaus approached and, using gestures and a few words of English, demonstrated a different technique for securing the wire. It worked perfectly. Frank looked at him for a long moment, then nodded and said, "Good job." It was a small but significant moment. It was a recognition of competence, of shared humanity, of mutual respect that the war tried but could not completely erase. These daily interactions created an environment in the camp that was remarkably different from other prison camps. There was less tension, less of the constant confrontational atmosphere that characterized many POW installations. Major Harrison wrote in one of his reports, "The civilian guards we employed demonstrated a remarkable ability to maintain order through presence and territorial knowledge rather than traditional military force. The prisoners respect them not as soldiers, but as masters of an environment they themselves cannot dominate." But it wasn't all harmony and mutual understanding. There were challenges and moments of tension. Some of the German prisoners were committed Nazis, members of the SS, or deeply ideological individuals who viewed any cooperation with the Americans as treason. These men tried to maintain strict military discipline among the prisoners, punishing those who became too friendly with the guards, organizing political education, and maintaining the hierarchical structure of the German army within the camp. The cowboys quickly recognized these dynamics. They might not understand German, but they understood body language, social power, and the signs of tension within groups. A cowboy named Red Johnson, known for his ability to read animal behavior, applied the same logic to the prisoners. He identified the natural leaders, those whom others followed, and focused his attention on them. Not in a confrontational manner, but through direct respect and strategic inclusion. Red began involving the prisoner leaders in decisions about work organization, resolving prisoner disputes and other daily matters. He gave them responsibility, which satisfied his need to maintain authority, but also made them complicit in maintaining order. It was a subtle form of co-optation that worked with human psychology rather than against it. There was a particularly tense incident in December 1943. A group of younger prisoners, influenced by the more ideological elements, planned a revolt. Not an escape, but a show of force, perhaps taking some guards hostage, making demands. The plan was ambitious and dangerous, but it was discovered not by the guards, but by other prisoners who exposed it. Older prisoners, especially those who had worked with the Cowboys and developed relationships, decided they didn't want bloodshed. When the Cowboys learned of the plan, their response was calculated. Instead of mass arrests or harsh punishment, they simply changed work assignments. The most problematic prisoners were separated, placed in different groups and given more isolated work. The Cowboys increased their visible presence, riding around the camp perimeter more frequently, but without drama or overt threats. They were simply more present, more visible, reminding everyone that they were watching, and they did something even smarter. They organized a demonstration of horse and roping skills. They invited all the prisoners to watch. The Cowboys demonstrated rodeo, roping, marksmanship, and horse control. It was entertaining, but it was also a subtle reminder of competence, of men who were masters of their tools and environment. The message didn't need to be said out loud. These men may appear relaxed, but they are professionals in their field. The planned revolt never happened. The leaders simply lost the support of other prisoners who decided that the status quo was acceptable, perhaps even preferable to the uncertain alternative of confrontation. Meanwhile, the success of the New Mexico camp was being noticed. Other camps in Texas, Arizona, and parts of California began adopting similar models, recruiting local cowboys and ranchers as guards. Each location developed its own variation of the system, but the basic principles remained the same. Using territorial knowledge as the first line of defense, employing men who understood psychological management through years of working with animals and the land, and maintaining a balance between firm authority and humane treatment. A fascinating aspect of this period was how it changed both guards and prisoners. Many cowboys who had never traveled beyond their home regions now interacted daily with men from another continent, another culture, another language. This broadened their perspectives in unexpected ways. Similarly, German prisoners, many of whom had been fed propaganda about Americans, now saw a different side of America, one not found in Hollywood movies or war reports, but in the daily lives of working men in the West. There were interesting cultural exchanges. Some cowboys taught Germans how to ride horses properly, a skill many infantrymen had never developed. In return, some Germans taught carpentry or metalworking techniques they had learned in their previous lives. There were even instances of prisoners teaching music, playing improvised instruments, while cowboys played harmonica or guitar around campfires at night. These human interactions didn't erase the reality of war. Long letters arrived from home to the prisoners, bringing news of bombed cities, displaced families, and dead loved ones. The cowboys also received news from the front, of sons and brothers fighting overseas, sometimes wounded, sometimes dead. The camp existed in this strange space, where enemies at World War shared a temporary territory, united only by circumstance and the desert around them. As 1944 progressed and the war in Europe intensified, more prisoners arrived. The camp expanded, and with it the number of cowboys employed. Some of the original guards became supervisors, training new recruits on how to manage the prisoners. This training was not military in the traditional sense. There were no procedure manuals or formal drills. It was more like an apprenticeship, with older cowboys teaching younger ones through demonstration and experience. One of the most important lessons was about perception. Cowboys taught new rangers to observe, to notice who was talking to whom, to recognize when the atmosphere in the camp changed, when tension was in the air, to recognize the signs of planned escape or imminent confrontation. These were skills cowboys had honed over lifetimes of working with animals, where reading subtle signals could mean the difference between safety and danger. There was one moment in particular that exemplified the effectiveness of this system. It was July 1944, shortly after D-Day. News of the Normandy invasion reached the camp, and the atmosphere among the prisoners grew tense. Some were despondent, realizing that the war was turning decisively against Germany. Others became more defiant, insisting that secret weapons would change the course of the war. There was real potential for violence between different factions of prisoners. The cowboys sensed the tension immediately, but instead of overtly increasing security, which could have precipitated the very conflict they wanted to avoid, they did something different. They organized a massive workday, mobilizing nearly all the prisoners for a levee-building project that would benefit local ranches. Intense physical labor under the desert sun. It was exhausting but also unifying. Men working side by side, too tired at the end of the day to argue about politics or war. This was a demonstration of sophisticated psychological understanding. The cowboys intuitively understood that idleness breeds conflict, that work provides purpose, and that physical exhaustion can be a more effective tool of control than punishment or threats. As the winter of 1944 approached, the camp had settled into a rhythm. There was routine, predictability, and a shared sense of temporary normalcy amid the chaos of World War. The cowboys had proven that their method was not only viable, but superior in many ways to traditional military-controlled camps. Escape rates were lower, operating costs were lower, and there were fewer violent incidents. Major Harrison, who had initially been skeptical about the use of untrained civilians, became a vocal advocate for the system. He wrote detailed reports for the War Department, recommending the model's expansion to other fields. He argued that cowboys possessed skills that could not be quickly taught, skills developed over decades of living in the wilderness and working with land and animals. He called this innate territorial competence, but there was a profound irony in the situation. Many of the cowboys were men modern society was leaving behind. The West was changing. Ranches were being sold, replaced by industrial agriculture. Roads and cities were expanding into the desert. The cowboy life, which had been a dominant cultural force for generations, was slowly disappearing. And yet here, at this particular moment in history, their skills were not only relevant but essential. The German prisoners noticed this too. Many of them commented, in surviving letters and diaries, on how the cowboys seemed to be from another time, representatives of an era that was ending. There was a nostalgic respect in this, a recognition that they were being guarded by men who represented something that modernization was eliminating, both in America and in Germany. As 1945 arrived and the war in Europe neared its conclusion, the atmosphere in the camp changed again. The prisoners knew Germany was losing. News of the Allied advance, the collapse of the German lines, and the discovery of the concentration camps all reached the camp through newspapers and radio. For many prisoners, especially those who were not ideological Nazis, there was relief mixed with fear for what they would find when they finally returned home. The cowboys continued their work with the same consistency they had always shown. They didn't publicly celebrate the Allies' impending victory, nor did they rub defeats in the prisoners' faces. They simply maintained their routine, maintained order, and continued treating the prisoners with the same blend of firmness and humanity they had demonstrated from the beginning. In May 1945, when the German surrender was announced, the camp gathered all the prisoners. Major Harrison made a formal announcement about the end of the war in Europe. Some prisoners wept, others remained in shocked silence, some expressed relief. The cowboys simply watched, giving the men space to process the enormity of the moment. But the war did not end immediately for the prisoners. The repatriation process would take months, in some cases years. Germany was in ruins, divided between occupying powers, and there was no adequate infrastructure to quickly absorb hundreds of thousands of returning POWs. Many of the prisoners remained in American camps until 1946 and beyond. During this period of transition, the relationship between the cowboys and the prisoners evolved further. They were no longer enemies at war, but neither were they free friends. They existed in a peculiar limbo, sharing space and time while the outside world reorganized. Some of the prisoners expressed a desire to remain in America. They had seen the country, worked the land, and some decided they preferred the new world to the destruction that awaited them at home. The Cowboys, for their part, were surprised to discover that they had developed a certain fondness for some of the Germans. It wasn't friendship in the traditional sense, but a human connection forged through years of daily interaction. There was one prisoner in particular, a man named Friedrich, who had worked consistently with cowboy Tom Harden, the same man who had drawn the map in the sand on the first day. Friedrich had been a farmer in Bavaria before the war, and he and Tom had developed a mutual respect through their shared labor. When it was time for Friedrich to return to Germany, Tom gave him a small gift, a keychain with a miniature horse carved from wood. It was a simple gesture but loaded with meaning. Friedrich accepted the gift, shook Tom's hand and said in improved English, "You taught me this desert. I never forget it." Tom simply nodded, unable to find words suitable for the moment. They were men of action, not of emotional speeches, but they both understood that they had shared something uncommon, a humanity that transcended the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. As the last prisoners finally left the camp in 1946, the Cowboys returned to their former lives. Some returned to ranches struggling to survive in a changing economy. Others found they couldn't easily reintegrate, having spent years in a routine that, however strange, had become familiar. There was a sense of loss, not for the prisoners necessarily, but for the clarity of purpose that work had provided. Major Harrison wrote a final report on the camp and the Cowboy Guard system. He documented the statistics, the low escape and incident rates, and the reduced costs compared to other camps. But he also included personal observations about what he had witnessed. He wrote about how men without formal military training had developed a system of control based on territory, psychology, and mutual respect. He argued that there were broader lessons here about human nature, about authority, about what truly maintains order in societies. His report was filed in the military records, read by a few senior officers, and then largely forgotten as the nation turned to post-war reconstruction and the challenges of the emerging Cold War. But the stories persisted. In the bars and saloons of small towns in New Mexico, Texas, and Arizona, cowboys who had served as rangers occasionally shared their experiences. They spoke of the Germans they had met, the escape attempts they had foiled, the moments of unexpected human connection. These stories became part of the oral tradition of the American West, shared on nights around campfires, passed down from generation to generation. Across the Atlantic, some former prisoners also kept memories. Friedrich, the Bavarian farmer, kept the miniature horse keychain throughout his life. When his grandchildren asked about him, he would tell stories about the American wilderness, the cowboys who guarded it, and how he learned that enemies can be just men under different circumstances. Other former prisoners wrote memoirs, some published, others remaining in private family diaries, documenting their experiences in those remote camps. There was a profound truth to what happened in those desert camps that transcended the simple narrative of prisoners and guards. It demonstrated how context shapes behavior, how environment can be more powerful than weapons, how genuine authority comes not from titles or uniforms, but from demonstrated competence and earned respect. The Cowboys never had modern weapons. Their weapons were antique revolvers, hunting rifles, tools they had used all their lives for work, not war. But they had something more valuable, complete and absolute knowledge of their territory. They could read the desert like an open book, predicting where water would be found, where dangers lurked, how the terrain changed with the seasons. This knowledge made escape not only difficult but irrational, because the prisoners quickly understood that they were in a completely alien environment, a world where their captors were natives and they were perpetually foreign. And then there was the issue of psychology. Cowboys had spent decades managing large, potentially dangerous animals, cattle that weighed half a ton and could easily kill a man if mishandled, horses that needed to be tamed, read and understood on a deep level. This work developed specific skills: patience, reading body language, understanding when to be firm and when to be gentle, recognizing social hierarchies within groups. All of these skills translated directly to managing groups of men. Cowboys instinctively understood group dynamics, could identify leaders and followers, and recognized when tension was building before it exploded into violence. And they knew how to diffuse situations not through overwhelming force, but through calm presence and quiet authority. There was also an element of mutual respect that emerged specifically because the Cowboys were not traditional soldiers. The German prisoners, many of them seasoned combat veterans, initially viewed them with disdain. But that disdain quickly transformed into something else when they realized that these seemingly simple men possessed extraordinary skills in their own domain. There was a fundamental honesty to this. The Cowboys didn't pretend to be something they weren't. They were exactly what they appeared to be, men of the wilderness, competent in their territory, willing to do a job that needed to be done. As the years passed after the war, historians began examining the experience of prisoners of war in America. They found that of the approximately 400,000 German prisoners held in the United States during the war, escape rates were remarkably low compared to camps elsewhere. And when they looked specifically at the camps in the American Southwest, those guarded by local cowboys and ranchers, the rates were even lower. There were several explanations for this. The desert environment was certainly a significant factor. But it wasn't just that. Camps in other regions also had geographic barriers, hostile climates and distances from populated areas. What was different in the Southwest was the complete integration of the environment into the security strategy, mediated by men who were an inseparable part of that environment. A military historian who studied this period extensively noted that cowboys represented a form of authority that was disappearing from the modern world. In an era of growing bureaucracies, professionalized militaries, and increasing specialization, cowboys were generalists, men who could do anything, fix anything, survive anywhere within their territory. This complete self-confidence created a presence that was impossible to fake or quickly train. He argued that the success of the cowboy guard system revealed something important about human nature and social control. Brute force and the threat of punishment may maintain order for a time, but they breed resentment and persistent resistance. Authority based on genuine competence and earned respect creates a different kind of order, more stable, less dependent on constant surveillance. German prisoners did not attempt to escape in large numbers, not only because they knew they would die in the desert, but because on some level they had accepted the legitimacy of their guards. Not necessarily the moral legitimacy of the war or their captivity, but the practical legitimacy of men who had every right to control them in that particular place because they were absolute masters of that place. There was also the work factor. Unlike many camps where prisoners were kept in enforced idleness, creating environments of boredom, frustration, and constant escape planning, the camps in the Southwest kept the prisoners busy. Working on ranches, building infrastructure, performing agricultural labor. This not only kept the men too physically exhausted to cause trouble, but also gave them purpose, a sense of contribution, and connection to the place where they were imprisoned. Many of the prisoners who worked on the ranches developed skills they would take with them back to Germany. They learned American agricultural techniques, irrigation methods, cattle management, and construction. Some even developed an appreciation for the arid land they had initially hated. There were reports of prisoners who, years after the war, corresponded with the cowboys who had guarded them, asking about the ranch's conditions, the weather, and whether that spring still flowed in the spring. This aspect of the story challenges simplistic narratives about war and captivity. It didn't conform to the idea that prisoners were simply victims waiting for release, or enemies, constantly seeking opportunities to resist. The reality was more complex. Men adapt to circumstances, find meaning in unexpected places, and form unlikely connections when forced into close proximity for long enough. There were, of course, limits to this humanization. The cowboys never forgot that they were guarding men who had fought for a cause that included horrific oppression. When news of the concentration camps and the Holocaust became widely known in 1945, the attitudes of many cowboys hardened. Some of the guards struggled to reconcile the men they worked with daily, with the atrocities being revealed. This created tension that could not be easily resolved. But even here, the cowboys demonstrated a moral sophistication that astounded observers. They were able to separate individual actions from collective crimes, recognizing that not every German soldier was responsible for every Nazi crime, while still maintaining moral responsibility for the war and its consequences. It wasn't forgiveness or forgetfulness, but a refusal to completely dehumanize. Even in the face of horrific revelations, a cowboy named Samuel Wright, who had lost a nephew in the war, expressed it in a way that was recorded in a camp chaplain's diary. He said, "These men here, they're soldiers. Some good, some bad, like any group of men. What happened back in Europe, the killing fields, that's another matter. I can't blame every man here for all that. But I can't forget either, so I keep doing my job, keeping them safe and contained, and let the judges and generals decide what to do with all the rest." It was a pragmatic philosophy, perhaps unsatisfactory to those who wanted clearer moral answers, but workable for men who had to live and work side by side with former enemies as the world processed the horrors the war had revealed. As the last prisoner left the camp in 1946, the buildings were dismantled or abandoned. The desert began to reclaim the land, as it always does. Within a few years, little physical evidence remained that thousands of men had lived there, worked there, waited there for the war to end and the chance to return home. The cowboys returned to their lives, but many discovered that the world had changed while they were guarding prisoners. The war accelerated changes already underway. Mechanization was transforming agriculture and ranching. Large corporations were buying up family ranches. The skills that had made them perfect choices for guarding prisoners of war were becoming less relevant in the post-war economy. There was a melancholy about it. Men who had demonstrated extraordinary competence, who had served their country in a unique way, now found themselves increasingly marginalized in a society that valued different kinds of skills. The era of the cowboy was ending, not dramatically, but through a slow erosion of economic and cultural relevance. But for a brief period during the war, these skills had been not only relevant but essential. The American government had faced a complex problem, holding thousands of prisoners of war with limited military resources, and found a solution in men most people considered relics of a previous era. These relics turned out to possess exactly the right skills for the situation. There's a broader historical irony here. World War II is often portrayed as the war that ushered in the modern era, the era of technological weapons, mechanized warfare, and decisive industrial power. And yet, in a remote corner of the conflict, effective control of prisoners of war depended not on modern technology or weapons, but on traditional skills, territorial knowledge passed down through generations, and competencies developed through decades of living close to the land. This story makes us question assumptions about modernity and progress. We tend to assume that newer methods are always better, that technology always trumps tradition, that professional specialization is superior to generalist skills. The prison camps of the Southwest during World War II suggest that the reality is more complicated. Context matters. Sometimes ancient knowledge and traditional methods are exactly what the situation requires. There's also a lesson about authority and leadership. Cowboys exercised authority not through formal hierarchy or institutional power, but through demonstrated competence and earned respect. They couldn't issue orders and expect automatic obedience based on rank or position. They had to earn compliance through presence, demonstration, and recognition of their absolute mastery of the shared environment. This form of authority is more difficult to achieve than positional authority, but it is also more stable and lasting. It builds relationships based on genuine recognition rather than fear or formal obligation. And interestingly, it worked in a context where you would expect formal authority to be most needed, guarding enemy prisoners of war. Declassified documents from the following years revealed that the War Department was aware of the experimental nature of the Cowboy Guard program. There were initial concerns that civilians without military training would not be able to maintain proper discipline, that prisoners might exploit them, and that escapes would be more common. The fact that the opposite occurred led to some internal studies into why the system worked so well. One such study, conducted in 1947, concluded that success depended on several converging factors: the hostile desert environment that made escape extremely dangerous, the genuine territorial competence of guards that made escape attempts virtually hopeless, the integration of prisoners into meaningful work that reduced boredom and frustration, and the relatively humane treatment that reduced resentment and motivation for violent resistance. The study recommended that in future conflicts, similar consideration should be given to using environmental advantages and locally competent guards rather than always relying on formal military personnel. But like many military studies, its recommendations were largely ignored. The post-war trend was toward more professionalization, more standardization, more reliance on technology and formal procedures. Perhaps this was inevitable. The scale of modern warfare, the complexity of military operations, all demand formal structures and professionalization. There is no going back to ad hoc systems based on local skills, but there is still something valuable in the lessons of the American Southwest during the war, something about the importance of understanding context, of valuing practical competence over formal credentials, of recognizing that different situations may require different types of knowledge. The cowboys who guarded German prisoners never received significant public recognition for their service. There were no medals, parades, or monuments. They simply did a job that needed to be done, using skills they had honed over lifetimes, and then returned home when the job was done. To them it was just another job, albeit an unusual one, but for historians and anyone interested in the complexities of human nature and conflict, their service represents something significant. It represents the possibility of finding humanity even in the context of war, of maintaining order through respect rather than force alone, of adapting solutions to the specific context rather than applying standardized formulas. The stories of these men, both guards and prisoners, remind us that war involves individuals, not just armies and nations. That even in extraordinary circumstances, people find ways to connect, to respect competence and skill wherever they find it, to maintain dignity and humanity when they could easily embrace brutality. The New Mexico desert is still there, still vast, still hostile to the uninitiated. The springs Tom Hardin drew in the sand in 1943 still flow in the spring. Cacti still dot the landscape, and if you know where to look, you can still find concrete foundations where tents once stood, pieces of barbed wire buried in the sand, fragments of an extraordinary story that unfolded there for a few years in the mid-20th century. There are no historical markers marking the site. There are no museums preserving artifacts. The story exists primarily in archival documents, faded memories of very old people, and stories occasionally shared in small-town bars in the Southwest. It's a story that could easily be forgotten entirely, another obscure footnote in the massive history of World War II, but it's worth remembering because it teaches us something important. It teaches us that solutions to complex problems sometimes come from unexpected places, that traditional skills can have value even in modern times. That genuine authority comes from competence, not titles. That even enemies can recognize each other as human beings when forced into prolonged proximity. And that the desert, that vast empty space that many see as a worthless wasteland, can be the most powerful ally of all for those who know how to work with it. The cowboys who guarded German prisoners in World War II did something remarkable. They took a potentially explosive situation, camps filled with trained enemy, soldiers guarded by civilians wielding antiquated weapons, and transformed it into one of the most successful and least violent prison of war systems of the conflict. They did this not through superior technology or overwhelming force, but through deep knowledge of their territory, an intuitive understanding of human psychology, and a willingness to treat their prisoners firmly but humanely. It's a story that deserves to be told and remembered, not as romantic nostalgia for a bygone era, but as a demonstration of timeless principles about leadership, authority, and the human capacity to find creative solutions to unprecedented challenges. The desert guards its secrets well, but this story at least deserves to be brought to light, examined, and appreciated for what it reveals about the best of human nature, even in the most unlikely circumstances. When the last veteran of those camps finally passed, taking with him first-hand memories of what happened in those extraordinary years, the story did not die completely. It lives on in archival documents, waiting for patient researchers, in faded photographs stored in shoeboxes in attics, in stories passed down through family generations, and now, hopefully, in our collective memory, as a reminder that human history is always richer, more complex, and more surprising than we initially imagined. The cowboys of the American Southwest, those men of few words and great competence, prove that you don't need modern weapons to control prisoners of war when you have something more powerful: absolute knowledge of the territory, authority earned through demonstrated competence, and the wisdom to treat even enemies as human beings worthy of basic respect. It was a lesson learned in the desert during the most devastating war in human history. And it's a lesson that remains relevant today, no matter how different our world has become since those distant days of sand. Sun and men finding unlikely connection across the abyss of war. And maybe, just maybe, there's something bigger to it all. Those cowboys, many of them men of simple and deep faith, believed that the Lord God placed each person where they needed to be, at the right time, with the right skills. They saw their competence in the wilderness not as mere chance, but as divine preparation for a purpose they couldn't have imagined. And when they treated their captives humanely, even enemies, they did so not just out of pragmatism, but because they believed that each man was a creation of the Lord God, worthy of basic respect regardless of the circumstances. On cold desert nights, when cowboys and prisoners gazed at the same starry sky, perhaps both recognized that they were under the gaze of the same Creator, separated by war and language, but united by a shared humanity. And therein perhaps lies the most profound lesson of this extraordinary story, that even in the darkest times, the light of human compassion can shine, guided by the hand of the Lord God who brings order, even in the chaos of war.